who are these people? Who are the readers in Cuba in the 50s?
In the 1950s, well, the readers, I mean, first of all, I've got to tackle the literacy argument just quickly because it is a fiction. Cuba's literacy rate was the third highest in Latin America at 76%. As you noted, 92% in the cities and obviously much lower in the countryside. Cuba was the third country in Latin America to have the printed press after Mexico and Peru, which were, as we know, the Spanish Empire's, crown jewels at the time. And so there is this long tradition of literacy that stretches back. Obviously, the literacy rate was a lot lower in the late 18th century, but there is this long tradition of newspapers, of magazines, of pamphlets. There were a lot of, a lot of pamphleteros, as they were known, all throughout the 19th century. But really, to kind of at least go into the 1940s, really the press expands exponentially. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The readerships grow, advertising revenues increase, more people are employed by the printed press. Obviously, the same thing is happening in radio, and we'll see the same thing happening in television in the 1950s. But the early 1940s and the mid 1940s, we really start to see this happen in Cuba in the printed press. They have access to a lot of the latest technologies and equipment from the U.S. So a lot of these commercial dailies are able to, to purchase the latest equipment that's needed. There's a lot of advancements. Some newspapers are actually printed in color. So we see a lot of movement that, makes this a very attractive product. And readers, particularly in I would say the mid to late 1940s, the newspapers start to attract more readers because of the increasing politicization of the particularly the front pages. A lot of political sections, and this was not the case before, but a lot of overtly political sections were placed on the front page. You had political editorials now on the front page. So as Cubans are reading, they are also becoming increasingly politicized. And as it turns out, especially during the Atlántico administration's outraged by what's going on, by the corruption that's being exposed under those administrations. And so Cubans are literate, they are politicized. You have a lot of people in the middle class that are reading the newspapers. A lot of people that considered themselves professional journalists were very outraged by what Batista was doing in the 1950s, and spoke up at international conferences such as the Sociedad Interamericana de Prensa, and they really did everything they could to bring to light what was happening in Cuba. But in terms of readership, even lower class, or I should say working class people, had access. And while some of them may not have been able to read, they would post the covers of certain magazines such as Carteles or Bohemia, some of these iconic covers they would post as art in their rooms. So they would still purchase these magazines. And more often than not, probably inherited magazines from their neighbors. So there was a differentiation between circulation, which was very, very high, particularly for magazines like Bohemia, which had the highest circulation of any publication in all of Latin America.
Yeah, the visual.
I hope I answered your question.
Yes.
I can go on, but
the visual, I think, no, you did. And I think that the visual stories that were also very emblematic of magazines like Bohemia or Carteles, and they always included very active visuals. They used political cartoons on the, at least Bohemia did certainly, and its back page. These are things that you do see when you look at photographs of people's homes, that they would put these, they would pick them up, they'd tack them up on walls. So one of the things then that you're pointing to is that, we have this kind of a raising of expectations about the accountability of government that comes out of the expansion of journalism and readership in the 40s. Then you have a highly politicized, readership by the 1950s that has to become accustomed, and it never does. I mean, I would say, obviously, it doesn't accept the degree of control that the state wants to exercise over the media and over what is available in the press. So one of the things that, and I don't expect you to say this in 2 or 3 minutes or less, but one of the things that
it's hard.
Yes, one of the things that your dissertation attempts to address is the question and of how Cubans managed to transition from what was this situation of high expectations, outrage over the limitations of those expectations that happened from the 40s to the 50s, and then extraordinary degree of violation of human rights and atrocities committed by the Batista regime that Bohemia and other publications really illuminates in the early months of 1959, and it just that effort sears itself into the consciousness of the population, which then surges in its support for the revolutionary state. So when you look at the early 60s and you see the transition from independent press to government-controlled, government-owned press, it is astonishing how quickly that happens. And my own research is, or a much earlier book, Visions of Power, has a chapter that I consider to be my baby, because I really wanted to write that. I wanted to, I wanted to know how did we lose this independent press in really like 6 months, from January of 1960 to June of 1960. So if you move forward though, how do you look at the period of the 60s, as a moment in which the state must have really struggled to create some sort of legitimacy appeal to their government-owned versions of what had once been independently owned media? So if you just looked at Bohemia, for instance, could tell us about that. How does the government take over Bohemia and then revamp it? The first question we can answer elsewhere, but how do they make that Bohemia, which has this huge circulation outside of Cuba, but within Cuba, how does it redraft Bohemia into an appealing magazine, given that no longer will it be independent, it's a government instrument?
So Enrique de la Osa takes over from Quevedo. Enrique de la Osa is very well known and respected as the director of the famous En Cuba section in Bohemia. So he already has this sense of legitimacy. And while the magazine itself is, for the most part, serves as an extension of the state and, a vehicle for the dissemination of state propaganda, does have certain spaces, particularly when you read the letters to the editor, where Cubans are, writing about their everything that's changing behind them. The trash isn't being picked up, or any number of complaints. And you see this especially in the early 1960s, and this is after the magazine is nationalized or taken over by the shop workers. And so you see some of these spaces, and even under Enrique de la Osa's tenure, there are some instances where he allows stuff to publish that the state is not happy with, particularly when Che Guevara is killed in 1967. He publishes a very controversial image. And then he publishes a story on the landing of the American astronauts on the moon in 1969, and quickly runs even more afoul of the government, and it's eventually retired in 1971 from that position. So I would say that in the 1960s there were still some spaces, but it was very
vestiges of the kind of democratic and democratizing means by which a magazine like Bohemia would appeal to an audience, but also give voice to individual Cubans who wanted to document what was happening in reality. I think you're cutting off with you're cutting off of De La Osa's period in 1971. That's the moment really when the Cuban press will become so formulaic as to be indistinguishable from something Soviet. And it's apparent. And not only is it apparent because you can look at the Soviet press and see similarities, but effectively all the magazines and the newspapers in Cuba begin to use similar strategies in order to get out whatever they think is news. So that one, to give one example, is sort of the headshot in the series of people, in a number of headshots, and then a little quote underneath from these 4 or 5 individuals that are all echoing in one way or another the party line, right? And that's classic of the 70s and the 80s, and it's even still there today. So speaking of today, I wonder, in the last couple of seconds that we've got here, if you could comment on what your hopes are for the sort of reinvention of a press in Cuba. Right now we have, because I think in the last 8 years since 2016, to just date it to the moment of opening in 2016, we certainly have more than just Yoani Sanchez and 14 y Medio. We have a number of newspapers that are digital in one way or another, and media that are online and that have representation in Cuba, but that are published abroad and available on the internet. That doesn't mean that people in Cuba are necessarily watching or reading that. But then we have this additional reality of social media, which is obviously a major conduit for documenting and sharing information independently of the state. For all that might be problematic in a government and in a situation like that of Cuba's, it is an alternative to what the state is offering. So nonetheless, that question still holds. As somebody who knows very well the history of journalism in Cuba, what are your hopes for what might be a reinvention of the press in Cuba if we have a complete and total change in the regime on the island in the near future?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? And I would say, first of all, with respect to the printed press, times are tough everywhere, right? The printed press itself is, all over the world, has really sort of declined in favor of digital media. So there is that, and in Cuba, as we know, with a lot of the shortages and scarcities that they've been experiencing lately, it's been very hard. They do not have paper. A lot of the publications that do publish don't have paper, and they can't publish. They have the writers are submitting the articles online, but they can't actually, print the hard copy because they don't have paper. So I think print media, it's rough everywhere, and I don't know it's hard to foresee. I don't see that coming back the way it was, obviously in the 1940s, 50s, in Cuba or anywhere for that matter. But you brought up a great point with digital media. The interesting thing is that all of these sites now, you can see them in Cuba, on Cuba, Ciber Cuba, Cuba Encuentro, a lot of these digital platforms are accessible in Cuba, and Cubans are seeing them and are able to they when I've been in Cuba the last few times, they're able to tell me, exactly what crimes have occurred where, right? And that was something unheard of before, where that was known as La Crónica Roja in the 1940s and 50s, where they would have police sections and crime sections. But that vanished with the revolution, right? Because it was only, the revolutionary government only wanted to really, publicize what was positive about the revolution. So these kind of crime sections vanished completely. And while they are not present in state media, you do see them really all over the place on these digital platforms. And particularly with the, what seems to be this really kind of wave of violence that has been, striking Cuba the last year, we're able to see that, I think for the first time because of these digital platforms. So I think while it's not great that Cuba's experiencing this, it's great that people are able to see it. And when I say people, I mean especially Cubans, are able to access this because internet access is much more readily available in Cuba than it ever was. So I think that's been the game changer. And my hope would be that, that obviously continues, but that, the state itself liberalizes what, the types of stories that they publish, whether it be it in the printed press or in digital platforms. Obviously, that would be my hope, is that they employ
a whole different voices. Yeah, different voices.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I just want to bring up a quick point, because you can still have and newspapers did in the 1940s at their height. They had their political tendency. Diario de la Marina was a very conservative newspaper that really was the voice for the Catholic Church, but it also had all kinds of columnists that wrote for it on a regular basis, including an Afro-Cuban activist, Gustavo Urrutia. You had members of the PSP, the Communist Party, who would write in Diario de la Marina. So even though, yes, their editorial stance was conservative, there were different voices, even in a publication as conservative as Diario de la Marina. And so that, I think, would be my hope, is that even though these, platforms may be for ostensibly the revolution, that they would at least allow dissenting voices.
Yes, that would be a radical.
And have polémicas, have debates like they used to, in the 1940s and 50s, where you would have, a journalist arguing with another journalist.
Right.
And that was great for the press, because people would buy more copies,
Yes.
But you would have, people arguing over and sometimes getting nasty with each other. But hey, we can do that now with where we are in 2024. Obviously, we do so in the U.S. That's a whole other story.
So I would say,
so, but,
yes, so I would say as a summary that if any of that happens, the greatest antidote to authoritarianism and to one-party rule is certainly pluralism. So perhaps a step towards a nonviolent transition in Cuba would include a kind of pluralization of something as dramatically one party and one voice as Granma.
Yeah.
That would change everything. Well, I want to thank you for participating. I want to thank you for participating in this Conversatorio Cubano, and I hope we have the opportunity to do something in the future where we have more about Cuban journalism, and perhaps invite folks who are contemporary journalists who write for many of the publications and platforms that you mentioned. That would be wonderful.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much again, Lily. This was really an honor. And,
thank you.
I'm happy to share what I know on Cuban journalism.
Thank you very much, Richard.